Well, hello and good evening. It's lovely to be here this evening, and it's great that so many are here on this really unpleasant, wet July evening for what is going to be an incredibly interesting exploration of Dannielle's practice with her. I'm really pleased to be here this evening to talk with Dannielle. I won't go through every detail of Dannielle's biography because I know you know her quite well, but it's probably pertinent to say that Dannielle was born in New York State. She lives in Brooklyn. She spent a lot of her life living in New York, though with constant trips to other places, particularly Mexico City, which we might talk a bit about later. She studied at the State University of New York at Purchase and the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Her work has been presented very widely, nationally and internationally, including in Paris, in Houston, in LA, in Berlin, in Chicago, many times in New York, and also in Dublin in this wonderful exhibition here at Kevin Kavanagh's. And she's participated in many international exhibitions, including at PS1 MoMA, the New Museum, the Brooklyn Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art also in Chicago. And several of her drawings are in the Contemporary Drawing Collection at MoMA, and as well as in other institutional collections in the US. Dannielle is Associate Professor of Art with tenure at the City University of New York at Lehman College, and she has held full-time university positions at Cornell and at SUNY Purchase, where she first studied. And she's been a visiting artist in over 40 institutions, which is quite a number of visiting gigs. And in 2020, she followed her interests in feminism and spirituality, which are long-held interests, which I hope we can also talk about later, by founding, in collaboration with the artist Sharmith Saray, the collective Hilma's Ghost. And this fuses art and magic. And it's a project which is introduced in many projects for you individually and also collectively. And I think we can see some of this inspiration in the current show, but it would be great also to talk about that and other work. But we are sitting in this wonderful show of paintings, of mobiles, which you might almost call three-dimensional paintings. And Dannielle, what would you like to say about the work that's gathered here?
Well, first, just thank you, everyone, for coming out. I know it's beautiful weather, and we're so happy to be here from New York, and it's my first solo show in Dublin, so I'm, thrilled to be here. And a giant thank you to Caroline for joining me, and to the gallery of course, for hosting it. And I'll just give a very brief overview. And I would say, I've been making, I say painting in the extended field, meaning that, all of the ideas of my work come out of abstraction and painting, but I make animations, I make wall drawings, sculptures, paintings, But the mobiles that you see here are really new to my work. So I've made a lot of mobiles that are soldered, that are much larger, but these are really lifted the shapes right out of the paintings and into the mobile. So the flatness really kind of extends it. And this is a brand new series of paintings, so just finished these, so it's nice to see them on the walls.
And you talk about how you said at one point that mobiles free paintings. How would you like to explore that idea a bit more? I find that such an interesting concept. If paintings are constrained, or what does the mobile enable the painting to do?
Well, I think, painting is really laden with so much history, and I think I really call into question, as an artist making paintings today, how do you really work with the ideas of painting and formalism and modernism and really recontextualize them, right? Instead of really just regurgitating, what is before you. And in some ways, I've done that in wall drawings, and that does that to a certain extent. But these elements in the mobiles directly come out of the paintings and the cosmologies around you. So they're files that are made, and then they are cut. So they're exactly the shapes, and the materiality is also very similar to the painting because they're the same paint. So the same colors and things like that. So, but I think the idea of them being free, and we were talking a little bit before about this idea of play, is really, for me, really interesting and connects into very early mobiles. And we all had mobiles as a child, and they're fun, right? Because they move and they free themselves off of the work.
They do. They are free, and they're also something which your paintings are complex. So are the mobiles. You have a huge cosmology behind them, but yet you can look at these on a number of different levels. And I find that fascinating as a viewer, just here this evening, looking at the paintings and the objects on the wall. Something I know you think about quite a lot is the idea of play. I mean, how do you think how do you incorporate the idea of playfulness in your work?
You know, I think that's come in a lot through Hilma's Ghost, and that is the collective you mentioned. And we created a tarot deck 4 years ago, and that idea of bringing in divination, play, ideas of chance, freeing elements off of a painting and then being able to recontextualize them are very, very connected to that, in a lot of ways. And I talk about that even with my students, like this idea of deep play. And I think sometimes we think of, hard edge abstraction, like this is very serious, and it is in some level. But this idea of divination and chance, and being able to move things around, it really opens how you can, recontextualize them.
And when you're constructing your work, do you have a clear sense of how you want an object to look, or does an aspect of play or divination come into that?
Yeah, that's a good question. People ask me this a lot because obviously the work looks very planned, right? They're plans essentially. But no, even when I make very large wall installations, and I don't plan them at all. So, because for me the pleasure is in when I lay down an element, how do I connect the next elements? It is like a game, actually. So it's how do I, kind of then respond to that. So if I made a drawing, I would actually be very bored, I think. There'd be no reason, there'd be no pleasure in me remaking it in a way.
So how do you decide to start on the surface that you're working on?
Oh, in a terrifying way. I always say starting them and ending them are really probably the hardest parts. I mean, I do have a vocabulary of over 200 elements, and they repeat in different ways. So I have a vocabulary. So I start by laying down probably by choosing a palette sometimes, although that also shifts. Laying down an element and then really starting to think, how am I going to extend that into the next shape or the next passage? But I'm also constantly flipping the paintings around.
Do you mean in terms of size?
Yeah, all
or
day. Like this.
Like this, you're
all
moving,
day.
Yeah.
So many times they just, even in a day, they can turn 2 or 3 times.
And do you come to a final idea of what orientation a painting should be, or do you flip it and change when you're
I have to say,
exhibiting?
They stay pretty organic like that. I mean, there was a few of these, and particularly this blue one, that it was flipped the other way, and probably till about 2 days before it left the studio. And then I decided, this is what you could do with abstraction, right? So that I could, I liked it better this way. But that, in a way, is also just a sense of keeping things open in the direction. And when you turn a painting over, and I know there's a lot of painters in the audience, so many of us do this, you're able to see it fresh again. It disconnects you to what's there, and then you can see what the next passage is or the next color.
And one of the things I find really striking about looking at your work in the gallery space, and we were talking a bit about it before, is how you use edges and borders and how those are part of the pictorial space too. Does that mean that that's one of the last parts you paint? Or again, is that not how it works in your process?
I would say that's still organic. I mean, it kind of goes up and down depending on the painting. definitely. So, I mean, I think the whole premise of it is that although they look very meticulously planned, they're rarely planned.
But also what's lovely about looking is the variety of textures and feels. And you did something earlier which only a maker can do, and as a museum curator I cannot do, which was touch the pictures and
them.
feel also the sense. I could hear the noise, the wonderful noise of your finger over it. And these are very sensory objects, I think, as well too.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, there's a lot of different paints and sprays into these. There's you know, flash, there's an element of spraying into them. There's elements like micaceous oxide in a few of them that are like crystals. So yeah, if you took your finger over that, not that I'm recommending everyone does this, but but you would hear the difference. So definitely, like, the materiality is hugely important, you know, and the mateness and the metallic and so forth.
And the sense that, I suppose, you know, you're creating something which looks as if it looks almost perfect, but what you like about it, and what I think we all like about it looking, is the fact that these are clearly made objects, and you can see where you've changed outlines and where you've, you know, you've really worked your materials.
I mean, that's very hard to see. I think when you look at these in a digital space, which of course, unfortunately, is how most of us are looking at work on Instagram or something like that, that I leave a lot of the drafting marks, tape marks, there's a drip. So there's definitely, my hand is in them. And I also talk about the idea of like digitally inflected space, that in some ways these spaces wouldn't really exist without a virtual world in some ways. But that's why we have painting, that you can come to this and they're slow. And when you're processing that, it's not slick. You know, there's elements of disruptions as you move through, and it's more of a meditation that you can really stay with.
Well, I'd like to come back to that idea of disruption later, because I think that's a really interesting idea to explore. But the other thing I find very striking about your work as it's presented is you are so interested in the relationship between word and image, and a lot of your practice has been about word as much as image. And the works in this exhibition all have wonderful, complicated, beautiful titles, but none of the titles are actually on the wall. How do you think about the relationship between the image and the word?
You know, when I started out, I was actually a poetry major and a painting major, and this is still a way for me to kind of create almost a format around that. So some of the titles, and I went easy on the show, there may be 2 or 3 sentences, but I have titles that are 1 to 2 paragraphs. And they read almost like a map. And so many times I'm naming the elements, and it's almost how you flow. I give them fictional city names many times. And it's how you almost are reading a cosmology or a map. So it's a way of organizing these shapes, in a sense. But also there's a language that I develop around them, of the shapes have names, like love-dot boilers or escape routes or things like that.
No, the words, I mean, the way in which you write about is also really compelling, and again takes you into these imaginary or sometimes not imaginary zones. But I love the fact that the title you picked for this exhibition seems to me to have, you know, incredibly strong elements of alchemy. And alchemy is something which has been so connected also to ideas of the occult as well too. I mean, do you define Chrysopoeia literally as gold making, or what does gold making in this context really mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where the Hilma's ghost starts to come in again, like this idea of, I mean, all artists, I think, are magicians and alchemists. You know, you're actually completely transforming energy. You're making something out of nothing, or you're really visualizing something and then creating that, and that is what witches and, you know, magicians do. But this idea of alchemy also fascinates, because it means really you're taking an element and changing it into something else.
You're making something rich and strange, in that wonderful Shakespearean phrase.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but you're also doing something which, and this possibly connects to alchemy too. You're doing something which doesn't have an end, which is a continuing story or a continuing circle. And I mean, does the figure Cleopatra the alchemist really fascinate you? Or
well,
if
it's
they
funny,
were,
Hilma's Ghost,
if they were.
Well, Hilma's Ghost just finished a series of dinners that I would probably contextualize as more social practice, and it was we do Cleopatra's Pearl dinners. And at the beginning of the dinner, which we've hosted for curators, we're doing one at the Guggenheim in the fall, where you have a pearl. It's actually, we created it, has a little flower in it, and you ingest it. So this idea of ingesting, and of course Cleopatra had a pearl and she ingested it as a source of like her power and of transformation. So I do, it's funny, we've been talking a lot about Cleopatra.
Yeah.
For sure.
Well, Cleopatra, I mean, I always think one of the most glorious evocations of it that I love artistically is the Italian 18th century painter Tiepolo, who shows the pearl being dropped into the drink to basically entrance, bewitch probably Antony.
Absolutely. And this idea is another level of alchemy of like ingesting, which of course you can't really do in painting, but you're ingesting in some way anyway, and then kind of transforming and being empowered, and that connects into feminism and many things like that too.
How fascinating. I mean, are you also inspired by the sort of Judy Chicago-like tradition of the dinner party, or is that...
Yeah, I mean, we just had a Judy Chicago show, and there's been so much dialogue in New York about it. I mean, I think the idea of the context of making something like that and having people come together, especially within, sculpture, and very, very interesting. I'm interested also in a way how to activate painting, even though these paintings are kind of a little bit more traditional, but I've had paintings where I've moved them every week in the gallery. Sometimes I hang them very low or very high. I hang them next to things in different ways. So I think the idea of testing how you're looking at a painting is intriguing. And that, in a way, that connects into Judy Chicago.
Yes, and one of the things I find very interesting, the way you talk about your practice, is that you say you're a painter whose work extends across media and into conceptual books, sculpture, installation, animation, and sound. And can you tell us a bit more about how you think about working as a painter in an interdisciplinary space?
Yeah, I mean, I always say, even when I'm working on animations or poetry, the ideas are really coming out of painting in some ways. And I think even within those titles, there's a sense of layering and materiality in the text. And I've also done a lot of kind of poetry books that are, there's heaviness in parts of the text, or obviously like the space around the words are really important to me. Or I'm very interested in list poems, for example, would be another that connects into actually how I lay things out in a lot of the paintings. But I think even within working within an animation, it's the ideas of again, hard edge abstraction, architecture, systems, utopias in different ways.
No, something I think that also your paintings are very much about is something that's not apparently obvious in it, and that's people. There's a presence of implied people, the lookers, of course, but also the people who are functioning the sort of utopias in some ways you are creating. How do you think about people?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because it's something I talk about a lot, in that in a way, these are planned spaces, and I don't know if they await people in a utopian way, or if it's dystopian and everyone's perished. That's maybe more of a pessimistic way of looking at it. So it's one way or another, but they're definitely man-made systems. And, I always say it's, it's very hard when I go to residencies in rural spaces. I kind of almost grind to a fault. It's like I'm in sort of this bucolic atmosphere. It's very hard for me. Like I'm really stimulated. Like I spent a lot of time in Mexico City and in New York, and the crazier and the more a city fails, the more interesting I'd be a terrible architect because I'm more interested in, or an urban planner, I'm more interested in things kind of failing or layering or disrupting in some ways. But those man-made environments are, more interesting to me in different ways.
But then it's interesting that failure in city terms can sometimes turn into success all the time.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
And in fact, it's often about what people do to a space that's made for them and how they make it into something very different.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm less interested in really orderly, kind of beautiful, overtly beautiful cities in some ways. I mean, I think that's why, Mexico City is just, there's an absurdness to it that is, like when you get into a cab and you say a city name, there's actually 10 city names that are the exact same way, and no one knows where that is. So it's like, which is like, doesn't make sense, right? So, I mean, there's something I think really interesting about that.
Yeah, totally interesting.
Because you actually had to find your route into the city.
And does that make you think about how, when you're looking at your paintings, when I was looking at your paintings, and I think, I'm trying to find a route, or I'm trying to find a way of getting through, or even like the board game, idea as well.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of a route, it's funny, I did a project, I wasn't even going to talk about this, but I did a project years ago where I interviewed cab drivers in New York City, all of them old cab drivers before GPS, the route from 14th Street. I was in this festival called Art in Odd Places, and of a route to the same place. And it was how they the tonality of how they described that route. And of course, New York City cab drivers are from 100 countries. So it's completely fascinating because it's also how they move through this dense city. And the chapbooks that I made were actually dictated their route, and they were left in cabs. People could find them, but they're very connected to the routes in the paintings, for sure.
When I read about this project, I thought it was a totally fascinating one as someone who's also obsessed by how taxi drivers map and find their way their city. And it also brings me to something else you think about, which is you often think about how, how unfamiliar places can awaken you to who you are and where they're from. And of course, these drivers in most cities are the newest immigrants of the lot.
They actually did this study on London cab drivers about how the cortex of how it was, grew, in how they studied the routes. I mean, of course, now we are all on autopilot, which is kind of, in a way, sad. But this idea of searching and wandering, walking through routes, which is actually kind of, in a way, what we're losing, in a sense,
But the route often connects to another idea that you think about a lot, which is the question of utopia. And we've talked a little bit about cities being successful when they're not functioning. When you come to your nomenclature, it seems very like the sorts of ideas that Calvino talks about in The Invisible Cities, which is one of my favorite books.
One of my favorite books,
one of yours too, which is why I wanted to bring it up.
One of my absolute favorite books.
But the idea that the city suddenly becomes the place not for reality, but for the most fantastical explorations of any sort.
I mean, that would probably be one of my favorite books of all time. And I mean, this idea of creating something, I mean, of course, that's out of words, but the sense of there's a story in that with all the strings. Does people remember this? There's a city made of strings that hold corners together, and then different properties and
But talking about the works in this room and thinking about cities made of string, when you are putting together the mobiles, you're using this iconography that you've developed, but is there a set pattern in those, or again, do you come to it in just the ways that?
I come to it. Well, the thing about the string is, I mean, this sets up a structure like a picture plane, like a painting. But there is an element of the cosmologies of all the elements and I moved a lot of these around to different mobiles. I mean, I have about 100 of them sitting in my studio that didn't make it into this batch. So, it's fun to kind of move, moving them around. They actually just become like a painting in a way of where you place it.
But they're also very much about, again, like the paintings, about the physicality of actually making. And I suppose this also connects to an interesting idea that I found in your work is this constant combination of the collective and the individual. You have a very clear individual vision, but it's clear working as a collective has been really important for you as an individual, as well as also in Hilma's Ghost as developing your practice.
Yeah, and I've also done a lot of other collaborations. I had a 10-year collaboration with a composer, Matthew Evans Taylor, where we worked a lot with abstraction and music. I made works, he used them as scores, he's performed my paintings. But Hilma's Ghost has been a really unexpected, the pandemic for all of us, of course, was unexpected, but, we started Hilma's Ghost and that it is me and Sharmista Ray, who is an artist who's originally from India, non-binary, they live in New York. And we started out hosting just Zoom. We were going to do community-based Zoom, and I said, well, let's collaborate with a witch, let's collaborate with a shaman. And we were very interested in this idea, and we're both abstract artists as well. And it has grown now into a lot of collective making paintings together. And we've had a number of shows, a number of dinners, a number of publications. But I think the idea that is very fascinating in that is that for me, this really brings in the idea of feminism, that painting really comes from this very, especially in New York. So I was, I cut my tooth on paintings like Pollock, and my teachers were, the secondary abstract expressionists, and their professors were the abstract expressionists. So this very male, Pollock, very, very individual, ego-driven work. So when you step into making a painting with someone else, and Sharmista and I, we set a painting schedule 9 to 5, so we're there making paintings together. So this is like a shared, it's a very different way of making painting. I think you see that in social practice, you see it in a lot of, but you don't see it in painting. This idea of stepping in to make a painting with somebody. And I think it's in a way what musicians know, what theater people know, is that when that works, it can take you into a completely transcendent space. We look at our work and I think, wow, I would just never have made that.
So in what ways does it push you?
Oh, so many ways. Well, I think that, we become almost a third person in that experience. And I think both of us look at the work and think, wow, this is really interesting work, but there's a detachment to that work that I don't have with this work. And because it's made collectively, in a sense. But of course, what's fascinating about it is that you make something that you wouldn't usually make as an individual.
And it's interesting.
And it tests your notions of painting. Again, I think that's what's most interesting for me.
Because the idea of the individual and the idea of the individual as a creator is really a concept of modernism. Way back, to the 15th century, when the first ideas of modernism really start beginning, I suppose, in political and other senses. And so, again, with your interest in spiritualism and in occult practices and in craft, do you feel that the collective is making you a completely different artist?
That's something that Sharmista and I we both have our own practices, obviously, and then we have this very intensive practice together. And yes, I think that there's no way to keep it completely separate. So for example, how we set a space when we're making Hilma's Ghost work is we're cleansing the space, we're doing magic, we're pulling tarot cards, we're spell casting. We're really participating in these experiences. And of course, artists have always experienced, have always worked with these, especially in becoming entranced in certain ways, like especially the surrealists. So it is, of course, when I go back to my own studio, I bring in some of those elements again, definitely. Because I know I can get to that space faster. You find a way to get into that space.
It's a really, really interesting combination of the collective and in the unusual, but many in this audience and elsewhere are working.
Yeah, I mean,
in
a huge
ways.
emerging timeline of this,
Yeah. And I mean, I want to open the floor to questions because I think people will have really interesting things to say. But something, again, I just wanted to end with really is that I'm very struck how, you're really altering our sense of time often in what we're looking at in your work. And as an art historian, I did want to ask, do you think that this type of practice as a contemporary artist also gives us the ability to change art's histories?
I mean, I think we're seeing that, happening. I mean, especially with the spiritual, the idea of the spiritual in art. I mean, although I will say that I think, now it's like there's so much discussion, and we do a lot of these in Hilma's Ghost about how this is a new endeavor. Now you're seeing a lot of artists working with the occult and abstraction or spirituality. And I like to say, that is nothing new at all. I mean, that is all the way, you look at early Tantra drawings, you look at Islamic architecture and decoration, nothing new. There's always been that language. You look at actually a lot of, Celtic design is another great example of that, is that abstraction has always been embodied in this. What has gone into the art history books, as we all know, is deleted a lot of that.
Well, the great thing about art history is that it can and is changing, often in relationship to art practice. Dannielle, thank you very much for being so open about your practice tonight and giving us some really interesting threads to think about and to mull on, and also a beautiful exhibition, which we will all come back and enjoy over the next while. And again, something which takes us into different spaces and places from the centre of Dublin. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And please ask questions. I don't know if anybody has one they want to begin with.
Hi, Gwen. Hi.
You mentioned a vocabulary, and I'm just wondering if you could expand on that a little. Is that something that you developed at one time, or as you traveled, you kind of bring new elements into the vocabulary? And is it something that only you should understand, or do you share it with your collaborators?
So the language in these paintings is all mine. It's not Hilma's Ghost. And I would say that I've created it over the past probably 15 years. And I will just give you an example, that shape in the middle is, I call that a connector. All the checkered routes are escape routes. Up in top is a safety chrysalis. Where's a love dot boiler? Let me find one for you. There's a love dot boiler, which humanizes the system because there's no. So there is a language. I would say that it is in my titles sometimes, but I don't put it out as a where's, come in and let's find the love dot boiler, because it becomes very limited. But I don't hide it either. They morph and they shift, and that language stays and people recognize that in different paintings. And it changes. I mean, not all the elements go into every painting. And there's definitely new ones that show up.
Any other questions?
Can you talk about more about the connection with Mexico City? Because it had a studio in New York, several studios in New York, and chaos. That's part of your ability or endeavor to make this work. Mexico City will see it out more.
Yeah, I mean, Mexico City, first of all, Mexico City is a very different city than it was 15 years ago. So when I started going to Mexico City 15 years ago, there was very little painting, first of all. It was mostly video, mostly performance, mostly political work. That has changed dramatically. But I will say what it did for me is that as I went through American art schools, and American art schools were, you were in painting, or you were in sculpture, or you were in video, or wherever you were doing. And even in graduate school at the Art Institute of Chicago, we were not in the same building as the sculptors. And fiber, new media, God knows where they were. I mean, we don't even know, another building. So when I started going to Mexico City, it was, artists had this complete flexibility in making a painting and then a video and then an installation. And I mean, that might sound like so common now, but it wasn't. I was so trained to work just on paintings. And so it really just completely, I think, conceptually opened things for me. And then the idea also of the muralists were huge for me. Because this idea of being able to take a painting out of a very safe place, out of a gallery, putting it out on the street, having people interact with it. But then the city itself is just, constantly challenging and constant disruption and constant absurdity. And so, and which I kind of love, in a lot of ways.
Are you spending more time there?
What'd you say?
Are you spending more time there?
I go back and forth, and and again, it's shifting so much, such an amazing place right now. Culturally, there's so many artists from everywhere. So it's been interesting to see it, how it's transformed as well. Hi.
I'd like to ask you about the kind of space that the elements seem to fill in the paintings. And is that an actual space? Some of them imply there's like a floor space and like an internal space. Or how do you think of that space? What is that space? Because this is so different to me in that the art space.
Right.
So,
Yeah, well, I will say first of all, I drive architects crazy or engineers because they're like, am I looking at this in plan? Am I looking at this way? Because it's disorienting, right? So sometimes it's an overview and sometimes it's a side cut and it shifts constantly. And for me, that's what you can do in a painting that you can't do in a plan. But I do think of them also as different climates sometimes, different temperatures, different places. I love the reference to Italo Calvino's, sometimes I think I have nocturnal paintings a lot, different climates. A lot of these have different times of the day in the titles. So I do think of them having properties of spaces. But I don't make literal spaces, for me, that's the great thing about painting, is that it can have this kind of fantastical, in a way, failed space.
When you mentioned about the symbols and it being almost like a secret language, and it made me think of an artist which I would never have dreamed of thinking about in relationship with work, and that's Forrest Best. And is that a mad kind of connection? Because he had a kind of profound spiritual side to him.
Oh, yeah.
I know it's sort of bothered, but is that a mad kind of thought?
Oh no, I love Forrest Best, and no, I think the idea of having a coded language like he did is very connected. And there were so many artists like this. And I went to graduate school right when Henry Darger was being discovered. And I'm a little less interested in those paintings for a number of reasons. But Henry Darger actually under his bed would record the psychic weather every single day for, and that I'm completely obsessed with. Like it's like that kind of cataloging and coding, and definitely that would connect into Forest Bess for sure. And like, yeah, it is like there are meanings embedded in the shapes, and you know, you can start to read them at a certain level. Like when you have like that loved up boiler, if you knew what that meant, like this with the little drops, you would start to know that this is about bringing in this humanizing, like human kind of element to the picture. But you can also look at it as an abstract shape, obviously. And I think that very much connects into just language, you know, and it's, you know, and like how you start to like look at language, and how when you start to learn a language, you can understand parts of it. And then obviously you can become fluent, but you can also look at something and enjoy just how it looks visually without that meaning. And that connects back into poetry, for sure.
Well, I think I just
Anybody else
want to
for
say
time?
thank you very, very much, Dannielle. Thank you for that really enlightening conversation about your work and practice. Thank you so much, and
Thank you so much.
congratulations.
Thank
on
you
the
to
wonderful
everyone who came. Thank you. That was great. Thank you.
Not at all. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, let's move.